Phil Sterling is the program manager for building sites for butterflies at Butterfly Conservation. Now, I really love butterflies. I'm a botanist, but I have an incredibly soft spot in my heart for butterflies. I've looked at them for many, many years, both in the tropics and in the temperate zone, and they are absolutely amazing. Phil was the principal ecological advisor at Dorset County Council for 25 years, and he advised on the design of the wildflower banks on the A354 Weymouth Relief Road. And every spring and summer, these roadside banks look amazing with flowers. They look stunning, and they support clouds of butterflies and moths every summer. And they cost virtually nothing for the council to maintain. Now, many of you have probably heard that wildflower banks and roadside verges have been in the news a lot recently. Pros, cons, what do you plant? How do you do it? What looks good? What doesn't look good? The debate is endless. And I'm really looking forward today to hear Phil, who's a real practitioner, who's done this, walked the walk, talked the talk, to hear him talk to us about how to make our road verges highways for wildlife. Thank you so much for coming, Phil, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Sandy. Fantastic. And thank you, Padma, also for the original invitation. So how do we make our road verges highways for wildlife? This story comes from my working at Dorset County Council as their ecologist for 25 years, where I'd been involved in a number of large-scale schemes, not just road schemes, but also restoration of mineral sites, of landfill sites, where effectively you've got a blank canvas as an ecologist to try and do your best to create the habitats for tomorrow on these sites which are constructed or restored. And for the last 4 years of my tenure at Dorset County Council, I was put in charge of all of the green space management, the country parks, the rights of way, open spaces, but that also crucially included the road verges, so the management of the contracts, of the staff, of the budget. And when you put an ecologist in charge of management of such significant areas as road verges, things happen. And it was the first time that I was able to effectively put my grounding as an ecologist into practice on a very big scale. And the story is this lunchtime then is to tell you about what the effects are, and indeed how we should now all be looking to road verges as a way of encouraging wildlife. And I hope by the end of this half hour you'll be feeling somewhat uplifted, because I think the story is a good one and that we should be optimistic about the future for wildlife on road verges. So let's go to the first slide, and here we can see on the left here's a standard road verge created on a new road. This is in the middle of Leicestershire in England, and it's very standard, isn't it? It's got its green grass, it's got some trees planted, and it all looks very neat and tidy. But it's not zinging, is it? It's not wonderfully full of wildflowers. Look on the right-hand side, and this is the A354 Weymouth Relief Road, and it is instantly, you can see the yellow there of the vetches on the verges. And what I'm going to talk to you about is how this story works time and time again. And what it's down to is soil fertility. Because if we think of our road verges not just as a bit of green stuff that needs to be managed from time to time to keep it safe or tidy, but if we think of it as a grassland ecosystem, and we think about what makes the grass grow, we realize that actually, of all the things that make grass grow, soil fertility is one of those things that we can control. So we can't control the amount of light or heat or water, the other three main factors that make grass grow, but we can control soil fertility. And if you look at this slide here, you can see here's the same length of road verge, just 100 meters apart, that my engineering colleagues created. And on the left that had the standard prescription, which was 150 mil of topsoil, nice, good garden soil, and they sowed amenity grass on top of that. And not surprisingly, the grass has grown. And on the right-hand side, they'd run out of topsoil. It's still green, but actually look at the grass growth. It's hardly anything. And that is the key to all of this. Look back at that first slide and you'll see 2 dandelions and a daisy in view. And the rest of it is tall, thick grass. On the right-hand side, lots of daisies and dandelions. And if you look even closer, you can see other wildflowers amongst them. And that tells you a lot that you need to know about the grassland ecosystem, which pretty similar all the way across Northern Europe, is that as soil fertility increases, species diversity of the plants decreases. It's almost a paradox. You almost feel like you should be putting more fertility into soil to grow more plants. But what that does is it encourages coarse grasses to dominate, and it shades out and smothers all the wildflowers that we'd like to see on our verges. Now, there are other consequences of that too. So let's look at the way nature designs higher biodiversity. And in reality, of course, is that along with those dandelions and daisies that we saw in abundance in the last slide, if we want to create our really diverse, floristically diverse ecosystems, then we need to look to nature. How does it do it? It does it in the least fertile soils. So these are the very thin limestones and clays and sands. So our sand dune systems, our chalk downlands, our limestone grasslands, these are the ones where we have the greatest species diversity of plants, and they are on those soils where there is the least nutrients, the least nitrogen in particular. So all those competitor plants that we spend our lives mowing, the coarse grasses, the docks, the thistles, the hogweeds and ragworts, they're all still present in these diverse swards, but they can't dominate. So they're just present as another species of interest. Now, what we can say then is that if we can control the amount that the grass grows in the first place, we'll have less to cut. And of course, if we've got less to cut, mowing should cost us less, and therefore we can spend time on other jobs. So not only does low fertility lead us to create and maintain higher biodiversity, but it should also lead us to cost less. And this was effectively my pitch for running the grounds maintenance service for the road verge maintenance at Dorset County Council was, I think I can save you a load of money and deliver higher biodiversity at the same time. But of course, does it work in practice? All the theory tells me as an ecologist it should, but let's see if it does in practice. And I suppose my biggest playground, I've done this on a number of occasions on smaller scale, but was for the Weymouth Relief Road, which was constructed between 2009 and 2011 in advance of the London Olympics, where Weymouth held the sailing events. And I was on the engineering design and construction team as their ecologist advising, and I had access to specify that the road verges should all be low fertility verges, that is hardly any topsoil at all. So a maximum of 15 millimeters of topsoil where the normal would be 150 mil of topsoil, or indeed wherever I could get away with it, no topsoil at all. So subsoil, clays, bare rock, sand, the sorts of things that you would automatically think of covering up. But I said, no, wildflowers will grow on this. We just have to be careful which species we specify. And on the right-hand side is the short list of wildflowers that I did specify for those road verges. And it includes a few species which we call pioneer species. So those are species that establish very well on bare ground without nutrient, and they are the formative plants of the ecosystem. And some of them are very beautiful. So looking here, we've got kidney vetch. So here is kidney vetch, 18 months, 2 years after I sowed it on these verges in absolute profusion. And kidney vetch is one of those plants that overall, I suppose it's probably not doing too badly in the UK, but it is in decline. And it's in decline because it likes growing on bare, nutrient-poor soils of all sorts, sands and clays and chalks and limestones. And it's a wonderful nectar source for bumblebees and other specialist bees, but it's also really important as the only food plant for the small blue butterfly. A small blue butterfly is in serious decline throughout the UK. It occurs from Devon to northeast Scotland, but the populations have been in decline for years and years and years because we're no longer allowing kidney vetch to thrive in our countryside. So where better to allow it to thrive but on road verges? And the colony of small blue on the Weymouth Relief Road across the 7 hectares today is certainly the largest in southwestern Britain, and is making a very significant contribution to the conservation of this butterfly at a regional scale. So it's a very important plant to include in our species mixes. An instant, what a result! Within 18 months of sowing the seed, this butterfly moves into the verges. Here's the same verge last year, and it's amazing. What's happened is that the wildflowers that were sown on there have now come up, and they are very slowly maturing, and that habitat is very, very slowly maturing, and it's wonderfully diverse. So this was the end of May last year, this fabulous show of pyramidal orchids. And the last botanical survey we did on the verges on 7 hectares showed us over 140 different species of plant on the verges, and we've now, with volunteers, counted over around 30 species of butterfly, which, for those of you who know, for the United Kingdom, is half the breeding list of butterflies in the UK. So in remarkably short order, in about 10 years, these 7 hectares of road verge, which would otherwise have been covered with some relatively boring grassland that needed mowing regularly, have become this wonderful home for an extraordinary array of wildlife. And in particular, my specialist interest is in butterflies and moths, half the species of butterflies that we would wish to see in the UK. I mean, that is a remarkable story and has to be replicable almost anywhere across the country where any infrastructure is being created where we can get away without putting topsoil on the top of the ground. And just so you're not thinking it's a freak, here is a picture taken just a few days ago of that same verge. And this year, for whatever reason, there are genuinely hundreds of thousands of pyramidal orchids all over their verges. It almost is eye-watering in terms of what nature has now done. What I'd set up, nature has now delivered in huge scale. Wonderful. But it's more important than just the biodiversity, because what's actually happening is that those verges require no maintenance at all. So those 2 pictures, no machinery has been onto those verges since they were constructed. The last person to walk there was me when I sowed the wildflower seed back 10, 11 years ago. And what this tells us is that we don't need to be managing our road verges, if they are properly constructed with low fertility soils, anywhere near as much as we as we currently do when the verges have got topsoil put on them. So if I've been working with Dr. Sarah Wynne from ADAS, who's an expert in greenhouse gas emissions in the agricultural sector, but she's kindly looked over the fence into the road verges, and she says that if you look at the low topsoil prescription in terms of not having to haul the soil from topsoil from the soil storage compounds up onto the verges during construction, and then by not having to mow it, say, any more than once in 20 years, then the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are involved in the construction and looking after those verges is tiny and is 97% less than the standard prescription, which would be to spread the topsoil and then to mow those green grass verges twice a year forever. And that's the point about this, is that actually we can genuinely, if we get our design right, we can genuinely design road verges to minimize the amount of maintenance at the same time as maximizing the amount of biodiversity, and to boot deliver that for local government and indeed for Highways England and other national agencies, a much reduced greenhouse gas emission on the back of it. But I just add this one in, and some of you who are from this country may know it, and that's the M27 between Fareham and Portsmouth. Here's a road verge that I followed over decades. This was constructed in the mid-1980s, and every year is an absolute picture of wildflowers, and has been so since it was constructed back in probably in the late 1980s. That road verge has had no maintenance since, and although you might say perhaps it could do with a little bit of scrub clearance in order to maintain the open setting of the chalk grassland, it is, after all, a road verge, but it has had no maintenance and is absolutely carpeted in wildflowers. That's 45 years without any management. So if we get these prescriptions right, our costs drop out in almost entirely for looking after these verges, and yet they are delivering huge quantities of biodiversity year in, year out, faithfully. But I think that's on the design side of things. So that's where we are saying, if we get the prescription right in the first place, we can design in high biodiversity, low maintenance, low fuel use. Can we retrofit this sort of low fertility approach to our existing amenity grasslands, to our existing road verges? And I'm sure many of you will have seen road verges looking like this, where as local authority budgets have declined, so the frequency of cutting gets less. And when the cutting does happen, you end up with a mess. And nobody likes it, not the least of all the local authorities don't particularly like doing it either. But you end up with this thick mulch of cut grass that goes brown, sometimes black. And what is happening in the grassland ecosystem here is that cut grass rots down and returns the nutrients to the soil. So we shouldn't be too surprised when the following year the grass grows just as strongly as it did the year before, but potentially even more strongly, because there are additional inputs of nutrients from rainfall and from aerial deposition, and indeed from gaseous nutrients coming from cars. So there's an awful lot of good reasons for wanting to get on top of this grassland ecosystem, because what will happen very slowly is that verges will get more fertile over time. Add to that the change in the climate that we're now experiencing in Western Europe, which is for extending the seasons, particularly in the autumn, where we get long, mild autumns where the grass continues to grow, and indeed slightly earlier springs, maybe not this one, where the grass will grow even earlier. So the pressure is on local government and the highways managers to cut the grass more, not less. And in the centre of London at the moment, they are now cutting 12 months a year of the grass. So this system has to change, or we will all be spending more time growing grass. And what we need to do is get on top of the fertility. How do we do it? Well, the first thing we have to do is convince people that it's worth doing. And because there's nothing quite so hot as talking to people about changing verge management. Some people will look at these pictures and say, these verges are a mess. Other people will say, wonderful to see the biodiversity. It's really important to talk to the community about their aspirations and their understanding of why things do and don't grow. So I've spent quite a lot of my time persuading people that actually this is what we want. It's better for the public purse and it's better for biodiversity. If we just stop cutting, and there is pressure to do so, you will see notices on verges saying, don't mow, let it grow. I've seen plenty of those. What happens is this, and this is in Burgess Park in London. What happens is the grass grows 1 metre tall, along with some of the wildflowers and the rest of it. That's fine, but nobody can walk in it. And when you hand that to the countryside service or the highways managers at the end of the year saying, now go and clear that, nobody knows what to do because their machinery isn't capable of dealing with it. And that's because it's the lack of understanding of the grassland ecosystem that says, well, if you just allow grass to grow, it competes and they all grow very tall and you end up with a mess at the end of the year. You need to reduce fertility. And we reduce fertility by moving from a cut and drop, which is our standard maintenance, to cut and collect. So we remove the arisings, the grass clippings, as we're going along. And if you look in this picture, you'll see that the grass has been allowed to grow really tall, a foot, 18 inches tall, before it's cut and collected. And that is because the nutrients are pulled out of the soil, the grass is taking them out and putting them into the leaves and the flowers and the seeds, and then you go and take it away. And if you take it away, it can't go back into that ecosystem. And having reduced the fertility, the grass doesn't grow anywhere near as long or thick or tall, and you end up with more wildflowers, as I've already explained earlier. So cut and collect reduces fertility and creates a really neat finish. So people who like their verges neat and tidy, they get that too. And it creates the base plan for more biodiversity. The process is really important. From my point of view, I always advise that we need to go in there and reduce the fertility hard and fast. So go in there and take 3 cut and collects during the first year. So this was a very dull verge created from agricultural soils and sown with amenity grass. In 2017, it had 3 cut and collects in April, July, and September. And this is a photograph in May 2018, where no cutting has been required. Normally the verge would be cut in April. And look at the wildflowers already in there. I know they're daisies and dandelions, but if you went there today, you would see a huge array of wildflowers that have naturally come into that ecosystem. And the maintenance has collapsed. It hardly needs mowing at all, twice a year. That's it. And here's some results of that. So after 3 years of cut and collect in Blandford, look at this photo, which was taken at the end of October, and the verge was last cut in June. So you still end up with a neat, tidy verge, but it doesn't need half the cutting it did have, and you can start to see some wildflowers coming in there, bits of yarrow, and there are other wildflowers in there too. As the years go on, the wildflowers increase. So here's what was a very dull verge in Weymouth, and last May full of wildflowers. And even this year, exactly the same. The wildflowers have changed a bit, but it's looking a picture. And what's really important is none of those wildflowers is too high to make the highway unsafe for users. So we have managed to get to this sweet spot where the wildflowers are able to thrive and perform their functions, and the highway is still safe to use. And after 5 years of cut and collect, and here's the Blandford bypass, this verge, when I took it on in 2014, was mown 3 times a year, and people used to go and pull the ragwort. And I said, we need to move this whole one onto a cut and collect system across 15 hectares. And 5 years on, so many wildflowers have now thriving in there that the local wildlife trust, the Dorset Wildlife Trust, have declared the site as a county wildlife site. So not only are we achieving that highway safety, but we're also achieving the wildlife gain. It's a remarkable story, but it works because trust in the ecosystem. That's what nature wants to do. If we want high biodiversity, we have to have low fertility. Now, one of the routes towards that is to look at pictorial meadow mixes. Pictorial meadow mixes, by that I mean those who remember back to the London Olympics will remember the Olympic Park was ablaze, was absolutely stunning with flowers. But do we call them wildflowers? Well, they were pictorial meadow mixes. They contained lots of cosmos and Californian poppy and ordinary poppies. What's the value of these seed mixes? Well, they are kind of okay, but actually there are very few truly native wildflowers within. Let's take in this picture what we call our native poppy, our red poppy. It's not a native species of plant, it's an archaeophyte. It was introduced into this country a very, very long time ago, but it is not a native. Also, the wildflowers that are in this picture, most of them provide limited nectar source for most of the generalist species that we like to see. Bumblebees, for instance, will be very happy on it. But actually our specialist bees won't, because specialist bees are after something different. They're after our native wildflowers. And also, as an expert in butterflies and moths, I can tell you none of these species in these pictorial meadow mixes provide food plants for the caterpillars of butterflies and moths. So although these mixes look fantastic and they're eye-catching, they're wonderful, actually they provide rather less in the way of resources for wildlife than we might like to think. So they are spectacular, but I do think they do have a place. This is the compromise, if you like, is that they are a staging post from transforming what was a very boring mown piece of grassland through to something more interesting. And in this conservation verge trial, which is just outside Wareham in Dorset, the parish council were really insistent and very keen to have a pictorial meadow mix. So we gave them that. But I said to them, underneath that pictorial meadow mix, I will instruct the sowing of native perennial wildflowers. And that's the view of this same verge just a few days ago. It has now transformed into native perennial wildflowers, just as I had specified and has happened. And it's absolutely humming with insects at the moment. And all the species that you expect to see in that verge are in place. And that verge, which used to be cut 5 or 6 times a year, all that's required to maintain it is just one cut and collect every year. That's it. So I see the point of pictorial meadow mixes, but it is not an end point. It's just part of the road towards it. All sorts of problems, disposal of arisings, won't deal with it here, but on road verges, it's really important to be able to dispose of the cuttings on the road verge as close to where you have cut them as possible, effectively to move the nutrients from the grassland into woodland. So that might mean new tree plantings into areas cut in brambles or underneath existing trees, not in ditches, not near watercourses, but sensibly close to where it's being cut. And that shift in nutrients is exactly what we want, because the fertility from the grassland is then creating above ground carbon stored in wood, which is so rather than having to cut the grass every year, we're permanently locking up those nutrients in the wood above ground. So it's a real benefit there. And just to show you by how much the cutting has reduced, when I took on the service, we had 5 or 6 cuts a year, sometimes 7 cuts a year on the urban cycle in North Dorset. That included Blandford and all the villages. When we started the cut and collect in 2018, which was admittedly a very dry year, we only needed to do 2 cuts. The following year, we either did 2 or 3 cuts a year, cut and collects, and in 2020, the same. So basically, Dorset Council has cut its amount of mowing across the whole county by about half in a matter of a very few years. And in terms of the time and the effort saved, our staff can now be out there doing more important things, such as maintaining the rights of way or leading guided walks, encouraging people to do more and different things in their natural environment rather than spending their time on mowers cutting grass. And it's a remarkable story, but it is one that has saved the council huge amounts of money. So when I took on the service in 2014, I had £927,000 in my budget to mow the verges. When I left in 2018, I only needed £680,000. And my colleagues who are still there this year have managed to get that budget down to £500,000. So soon we'll be at a position where half the highway verge management budget is required to what it was, say, 10 years ago. A remarkable story and delivering all that wildlife. Now, much of what I've had to say this lunchtime is set out in Plant Life's Managing Grass and Road Verges, and Plant Life, brilliant organisation in terms of promoting the better management of road verges for wildlife. So I commend not only this manual to you, but also the more recent Good Verge Guide, which has been republished by Plant Life. But I just draw your attention on the right to Highways England, who have really got into this low fertility soil approach and have recently issued what they're calling a major project instruction, which is for all new roads. So whether you like roads or not, and I suspect many of us here today are going, roads, they destroy the environment. They certainly do. But in terms of what we can put back on their verges, Highways England fully understand the biodiversity benefits of using low nutrient grasslands, and not only for their biodiversity, but also from a safety point of view, because the fewer people that have to go onto the road verges to maintain them, the less risk there is for those personnel when they're out there on these high-speed roads. So they see a safety benefit as well as a biodiversity benefit. And also, obviously, from a reduction in maintenance, there's also a carbon benefit. So there we go. By understanding amenity grassland as an ecosystem, we can design and manage our road verges successfully for wildlife. And the key to it all is low fertility. And because that's how our grassland ecosystems in Northwest Europe increase their biodiversity, is by lowering the fertility. If we do so, then our road verges, and indeed any green open spaces in the built environment, are demonstrably cheaper to look after, or should be. And in doing so, that will contribute significantly towards those carbon reduction targets that we've all got, certainly for local authorities to become carbon neutral by 2050. We're all going to have to get there, and reducing the amount of carbon that we use in cutting our verges is going to be part of that. And also, the safety critical areas is that where we don't want people to be out there maintaining the verges, then we don't have to have them if we use this approach. So there we go. I commend it to you. A fantastic way of increasing wildlife on our verges by using low fertility soils. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Phil, for an absolutely fascinating talk. And we've got lots and lots of questions, so I'm going to try to get through them all. Kevin has asked, over time, will these low fertility spaces naturally convert to higher fertility ones?
That is a good point. What's really important is to keep on top of the fertility in the ecosystem, and that's why the change is from the cut and drop technique to a cut and collect, where management does happen. So where you do need to manage verges, then the cut and collect keeps chipping away at the nutrients below the soil by taking away the grass, and that keeps the fertility down. In those verges where there is no maintenance, where they've been designed to have very little maintenance, yes, the fertility does increase very, very slowly, but it is very, very slowly. It's over a matter of decades, and you can see from my example on the M27, after 45 years, it really doesn't look as if there's much fertility in that soil. So I think I like to see it that if we are to adopt that system where we look at almost zero fertility when we start, the next time we need to manage those verges is when we next need to dig up that motorway to rebuild it. And if so, that is a fine time to get in there and rebuild your ecosystem, because it's moved from grassland to scrub or to woodland, and actually you want grassland again. So that gives us some quite interesting dynamics in terms of how we build ecosystems, and maybe we can start designing them where we actually design out maintenance entirely, and that we only look after them when that very infrastructure needs replacing. Interesting debate for the future, I think.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the kind of timing of replacement of roads as well, doesn't it?
It does, but my guess is that most roads will need replacing in somewhere in that horizon of 50 to 100 years. They will need a major maintenance scheme to look after.
So kind of not within the lifetime of many people, but enough to kind of make it so that nobody forgets.
Yes, absolutely.
Steph Holt has asked, she says, hi, Phil, is it worth adding yellow rattle to sites like these? I think she's meaning the high fertility ones that are being cut, to reduce the dominance of grasses further, or for most of these sites, is it simply not needed based on the success of cut and collect?
Well, good point. Look, yellow rattle is a beautiful native wildflower. Why wouldn't you want to include it? So we do include yellow rattle. Yellow rattle, it's patchy in its effectiveness. It works well where you're already into a cut and collect system, where it will add value in terms of the parasitism of the grass, in terms of sucking the life out of the roots of the grass. but we've never found it very successful where we've just continued with a fairly fertile grassland system. We have tried it where we've cut the grass, removed it, and then added the yellow rattle, and then gone back to a cut and drop system, and the yellow rattle survives for a while and then it just disappears. It gets choked out. So we do need to keep a fairly open soil structure to enable the yellow rattle, because it's an annual plant, to germinate at the end of the beginning of the following year, and it needs to have bare soil in which its seeds can germinate. So it's a species that's added value rather than going to fix the problem.
So cut and collect still is really the way to
Oh,
do
it
it.
is,
Yeah,
but there's no
absolutely.
doubt if you've also got yellow rattle in there and it is parasitizing the grass and it's reducing the dominance of the grass, when you come to cut and collect, there's less to cut. And
And
of
less to
course, that
collect.
less to collect, which is good, and it also means that the machinery you're using is the wear and tear on the machinery is a lot less. So
Mhm.
it is added value.
There are a lot of kind of moving parts in this equation, aren't there?
It's a living system.
So Elizabeth O'Brien has asked, are the various wildflowers that flourished on the cut and collect verges, the ones that you've you know taken and cut and collect, are those self-sown or have those been planted?
Right. For the most part, the slides that I've shown are ones where they have been sown, but a few of the slides were natural, so they've come out of the seed bank or have spread naturally through wind dispersal or birds. So it's a bit of some and some. I mean, I think if I were wishing to look at a road verge, a new road verge, and say, how are we going to make this road verge full of wildflowers? I think I'd want to look at the derivation of that soil. So if the soil had originally come from improved agriculture, where effectively the seed bank had gone, then I would say it was wise and sensible to introduce wildflower seed just
Mhm.
because you get a quicker effect. On the other hand, if there's any chance of an existing seed bank in the soil below there, by moving to cut and collect, you open up the sward. So you get little bits of bare ground, which encourages germination and flowering. And so the system gets going again. And naturally, dispersal will help with that. So in the end, cut and collect will deliver the biodiversity on its own without any intervention of seeding at all. But I don't know. We're in a biodiversity crisis. I kind of feel there's a bit of urgency in getting the wildflowers back, and that's my view. But I realise it's not a universal view, and some people actually are very firm that they wouldn't introduce seeds. But I'm afraid I see things disappearing before my eyes, and while I'm still here, I want to put them back.
Thank you. That's great. Rosie's asked quite a long question, which I'm going to read. So,
Okay.
in what circumstances would you recommend an annual hay cut collected after 1 week and a couple of additional cut and collects in the autumn and a checking of perennial invasive weeds rather than the no maintenance approach you described earlier in the presentation? If no mowing is being carried out on some of your sites, have you seen any natural succession of scrub or similar? You kind of answered a bit of that when you were talking about when they were talking about the conversion to high fertility soils, but it's a slightly
Yeah.
different question.
Yeah. Okay. So there are two bits to this. So in that ultra low fertility system, which I created on the Weymouth Relief Road, and we can see on the M27 outside Portsmouth, there is natural succession very, very slowly happening. So the Weymouth Relief Road, after 10, 11 years now, if you could probably still count the number of scrub bushes on hands and toes across there. So it's still ultra low fertility and not much has got going. But what's going to happen in the next 10 years? Inevitably, that scrub will increase, and it might even increase exponentially. But even after 20 years' time, I still think it's not going to be very much. So I think it's fine to let those systems go. And in the end, if you want to manage them as a nature reserve, fine, that's fine. Go and clear some scrub, create the patchwork that you want. But in some respects, they're probably going to be fine for 50 years. On the other hand, where we are taking existing topsoils and reducing the fertility, those seem to me to be systems we should manage much more as an agricultural system that's designed to encourage wildflowers. So the annual hay cut, and then something that effectively mimics that aftermath grazing, which is so beneficial to opening up the sward and encouraging germination.
Mhm.
So overall, and plant life are absolutely foursquare behind it. We're looking to something in the region of 2 cut and collects per year as being probably the ideal to maintain road verges and other public open spaces as being the most diverse from a botanical point of view.
Of course,
I hope that, yeah,
every place differs ever so slightly, but it
they
sounds
do.
like this. If there's a good recipe,
Yes.
then as a good cook, you tweak it the way you want.
Yes, absolutely. And the nice thing is from a system where none of us have been in control of this ecosystem. We have just left the grass to rot and return the nutrients, and we've wondered why the grass continues to grow next year. And we put ever bigger machinery in there to swipe it and cut it. Now we're in charge of that ecosystem. So if we want longer grass, don't cut it as frequently. If you want shorter grass, cut it more frequently. So let's take a lawn outside a municipal building, for instance. Now, you might say, particularly if that's a prestigious building with lots of people coming to visit it, you don't want to have stuff that's 2 foot high out there and full of oxeye daisies. Well, you might not, but if you want wildflowers in there, just cut and collect it a bit more frequently, and you'll end up with low-growing wildflowers that look equally nice, that are still performing their function, and it still looks very neat and tidy. So you're in charge of that system, and tweaking it is exactly what you need to do to make it do what you want.
Great. Leslie's asked the question that I was wondering as well, is how do you deal with waste when you do the cut and collect, sort of the stuff that people throw out of their car windows?
Right. Oh, yes. Yes. Litter is a real big problem, isn't it? Um, well, waste has to be dealt with in any case, but it's not dealt with by local authorities as systematically as I think we would like. So in those litter hotspots, which tend to be near industrial estates or near outlets where there are, drive-through eateries, then those are the areas which tend to attract the greatest litter, bottles and plastics and wrappers and all the rest of it. Most of the time, the local authorities will shut the road and send people up the road to clear that and put it in litter bags and take it away. What cut and collect does is, guess what? Other than mattresses and fridges, it cut and collects most of that litter. It cut and collects it extremely well. So what I instructed my staff to do is that where they're cutting and collecting from a road which regularly is littered, then you put those cuttings somewhere on the road verge but out of sight, where you can go back and clear that and pick it as time goes on, because as the grass rots, the litter comes to the surface, and therefore it's available. But it's also safe to do so because you're not right next to the live traffic. So cut and collect is actually a relatively cheap way of being able to pick up litter and to deal with it. And while I left the council, Dorset Council, before I could get that into motion, that's now what happens, is that there is less litter picking on the road verges than there used to be, because there's more cut and collect.
And in a way, the litter picking is a safety hazard as well for the people who
Oh,
are doing it.
it's very expensive because the road has to be shut, and therefore
Mhm.
that costs. It's inconvenient for road users because it tends to be shut for half a day, and there is risk, human risk. Yes, absolutely. So if we can avoid it, we should.
So another question is asking about the other aims of having natural habitats, along roads. And these are things like increasing tree cover, providing wildlife corridors for large things like mammals, increasing carbon capture. And do you actually weigh these up and then decide on what the priorities are, or all of these things complementary in the way that you've been doing this?
Well, great question. I mean, I think that trees on road verges are a controversial issue, and none more so than if you next drive down a trunk road or a motorway and you look at how big some of those trees have got that were planted 30, 40 years ago, and that now need clearing because they present a safety hazard to road users in the event of high winds and storms. So Highways England currently are spending huge amounts of money on clearing trees that were planted in all good faith for all good right reasons, back along to do with landscape enhancement, to do with wildlife enhancement, but are now trees in the wrong place. So I think when we consider trees in the highway, we have to think carefully about why, where, and where's appropriate. And there are plenty of appropriate places for trees in the highway, particularly where they're on embankments that are facing away from the road, so they wouldn't fall in any case. And there are plenty of areas where we've got large roundabouts, big, broad areas of land that have had to have been bought in order to achieve junctions and flyovers. Those have got big areas of land which absolutely need to be planted up with trees. But I do think there is we do set ourselves up with problems if we systematically want to cover most verges in woodland, because what will happen is that woodland will need to be cleared, and all of the carbon benefits that we're hoping to ascribe to planting trees on road verges will come to naught because we've got to take them away in the end. So mind you, it does depend what we do with the wood, but in principle, much of that it will be very expensive and will probably be chipped. So we do have to be careful about where we put trees. But so what do I think is I think most road verges, for good practical safety reasons, probably need to be open habitat. But there is absolutely space at the back of larger roads, and particularly the new motorways and new trunk roads, where we must and should be making space for trees and woodland and scrub, and indeed all the benefits that brings.
Great. Another question is about how you cut and collect on these very steep slopes. And would remove, and so there's kind of two questions riddled in here. Is one about how you cut on the slopes, and the second of which is, would removing topsoil be better on established road verges? Would it be worth removing the topsoil completely?
Yeah, great points. The reality is, and you'll have seen that on the slides that I've shown you, we don't remove grass on steep slopes. There is kit that's available, but it's very expensive kit, and it's a kit that by and large local government can't really afford to use. Possibly Highways England could. So steep slopes with topsoil at the moment are no. They are habitat in waiting, I think. It's possible to do it, and because it requires a long arm reach with a sidearm flail, so that's a tractor with an arm on it, with a flail mower, with a sucker on it. So you can see then that you've got to suck the grass into a hopper at the back, and that has to be on a different trailer from the mower. So you end up with a very big piece of kit that's very expensive. You then have to decide what you're going to do with the 1 ton of grass that you've got in the back there. How far do you want to trundle that before the cost of doing so far outweighs any of the environmental benefits of doing so? Mm-hmm. If there were biogas plants every few miles, that would make a very big difference, because you'd have a ready source of material to go in them. But we don't have that, other than in Lincolnshire, in this country. So that was the first bit. The second bit, to do with stripping the topsoil, I would love to see that. But the issue is, again, that transport of topsoil is that will work on some of the big schemes where they go into major maintenance, where stripping the topsoil and removing it to somewhere more useful as part of a major maintenance of the overall road would make sense, because it's all within that budget. You've already got machinery in there that's going to be there digging up tarmac and concrete and the rest of it, so it can dig up topsoil and take that away too. Yeah, so we need to look at these whole of life costs of management, as to, well, how much mowing needs to be done, how much would we save over a 30-year period, and then does it become worth removing that soil?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions about the subsoil, and about what is it when you say have these roads where you have a bypass and the old road is now decommissioned. Mm-hmm. Is it best to just, is it best to remove the surface and break up the subbase, or is it best to add soil, or what's the situation here?
We did try that on the Weymouth Relief Road, where the old A354 has become a private access for farm vehicles and as a cycle footway. And we dug up about half to 2/3 of the road and took it back to the sub base. And then some of that was covered in chalk, and then it was sown with wildflowers. And it's reasonably successful. It's not quite as successful in terms of its wildflowerness as the bare chalk, but it certainly looks very good and it's very appealing. So the old roads, I think there's always going to be a non-motorized access benefit of being able to open those as footways and cycleways. And I know the Stonehenge bypass, the tunnel there, if that ever gets built, the old road there is going to be converted back to chalk grassland, where they will remove the whole lot and make a chalk track, which then has got margins which are full of wildflowers. So it sort of depends on the circumstance and on the needs there, but overall you can leave quite a lot of the sub base there, because that's the same low nutrient materials that produce the wildflowers just as much as the
first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions. I'm going to try, there's so many questions. I'm going to try to kind of riddle them together now.
Okay.
People have asked about how you can do this in other places. So how can we do our own lawns in this way? And would grazing 1 month in 3 encourage wildflowers in place of cut and collect, or, sort of how can people do this in other kinds of situations?
Well, let's just take lawns. Lawns are very interesting. We can all do this on our lawns. What we tend to do is most of us are into cut and collect already on our lawns, but we tend to do it each week, and we let it get an inch high, and then we go and mow it again, and we're very proud of our straight lines and roll bits and pieces. That's fine if that's what you want, but if you want to encourage wildflowers, you need to let that grass grow long and then cut it. Because if you think about it, as you're cutting an inch off the grass, and if you did that 12 times a year, which is probably what most of us do, then that's 12 inches of grass that you've taken away over a season. I'm talking about taking 12 inches of grass away 3 times in the first year to reduce fertility. So what we do with our lawns currently is not reduce the fertility enough to encourage the wildflowers. So I would say get in there early, an April cut, let it get long, and then take that away, and then leave it for a couple of months and see what comes up. Or introduce some wildflowers that you can buy for native wildflowers from a stockist, and then let them flower, and then go back in again in August and cut and remove it, and maybe again at the end of September. But you're looking to allow the wildflowers to get going in a patch or your whole lawn, whatever you prefer. You're allowing them to perform their natural function before you intervene and cut and remove. So that's on lawns. What was the other bit? That was in relation to...
The other bit was about grazing.
Oh, grazing.
If you had grazing, would it do the same job as cut and collect?
Yes, it does, because in the end, what animals are doing are converting grass into protein. And then respiration and all the rest of it. So basically, they are nutrient removers from a system, and providing fewer nutrients are going in than are coming out, you are gradually reducing fertility. On the Weymouth Relief Road, we have provision for grazing of those slopes, and indeed sheep have been in there twice, but they're only in there for a couple of weeks because there's not actually that much to eat, and they make a very good job of it. But I don't know that it materially affects the biodiversity. On the other hand, if we were to introduce grazing animals into road verges that have not had the benefit of cut and collect, it would achieve the same result. And it's about how many animals, how hard you graze, as to how quickly that nutrient is reduced. But animals are very good at doing that, and that's why some of our very best nature reserves are managed by cattle and sheep, and the rest of it is about keeping the nutrients down.
Great. Someone's asked a question about air pollution from traffic and its effect on the soil, the plants, and the insects along the road verges.
Yes, air pollution is an issue, but I think we're not really quite sure how much of an issue. So through the New Forest, which is lowland heathland, that wonderful low fertility, sandy, gravelly soils in there, the A31 is a major dual carriageway carrying, 60 to 100,000
God.
vehicles a day, that sort of thing. A lot of pollution coming out of cars. It is possible to detect increases in nitrogen up to 100 meters from the road edge. So that's a long way into the heathland. However, the amount of nitrogen that reaches 100 meters is tiny. And so most of that pollution is falling in a very close zone to the edge of the road. And it falls with the inverse of the distance. So actually the pollution falls very, very quickly away from the road, but you can detect differences, not on that scale, but if you were to go into a piece of heathland where people are regularly walking their dogs, you will see from mainly dog wee how that is changing. It's liquid fertilizer that's changing heathland into Yorkshire fog grassland. And so you see these sort of regular dog walks where the quality of the heathland just changes to grassland in a matter of 5 or 10 years or so. So we do know that pollution can have an effect on this, but it's the scale of that effect and how quickly it happens. And my guess at the moment is that actually you don't think of it, but actually the pollution is not that great from cars to the extent that it's really materially affecting the ecosystem. Might be a bit controversial, but I'm afraid that's my observation.
Yeah, interesting.
Mm.
There's a couple of questions about the A354 bypass, one of which is what was the soil like, and the other of which is kind of related to that they noticed that autumn's ladies' tresses was in the seed mix, and did that persist?
Okay, right. Let's deal with the autumn ladies' tresses. They've never reappeared. They've never. So I put them in. I put the seed in the mix, and I've yet to see autumn ladies' tresses appearing. And what is really interesting is that some of the species, I mean, it was a guess. I put in bee orchid seed and pyramidal orchid seed. It's clear that they seem to have worked, but autumn ladies' stress is not. And it may well be that there's a species that requires decades of stable grassland in order for it to appear. So it needs to be an ancient grassland before a species like that will start to thrive, not something that Phil's knocked together in 10 years. I think that's probably what's happened there.
Although I
Uh-huh.
have my father-in-law's front lawn in
Uh-huh.
Kent is a lawn of autumn ladies' tresses.
Oh, wonderful. Well,
Just completely
that's
lawn.
wow. Well, brilliant. I mean, well, I remain
Amazing.
optimistic that autumn ladies' tresses will come in. I mean, I've introduced the seed. The seed will probably survive for decades in any case. At some point or other, the system will probably be receptive to autumn ladies' tresses coming in. So the other point about what was the soil conditions on there. So the Weymouth Relief Road was mainly constructed in fertile agricultural ground. So that was agriculturally improved ground over chalk, limestone, and clays, because it's a very diverse geology in Dorset, as I'm sure many people know, but particularly in that section comes through the Cretaceous chalk heading down to the clays near the sea. So it was a range of soils, but most of it, I think 90%, was agriculturally improved. And so the point was, I didn't want any of that agriculturally improved soil back on the verges. We did put it where we were doing tree planting, and we were making bunds. Those tend to banks. They were made of soil, but they were always dressed with some low fertility medium after that, in order to encourage the wildflowers.
Great. There's another question about plant selections in the face of climate changes. Do you see the selections of plants? So in those places where you are seeding the verges, do you see that there's going to be the need to really think about those seed selections in the face of climate change?
Oh gosh, yes, I think there is. I mean, I think for grasslands, it's probably less of an issue than it is for tree species and scrub species. I do think we need to think very carefully about which tree species we're trying to encourage. And I look at that from an entomological point of view, actually, as an insect person, as a moth person, is that increasing numbers of species are visiting our shores from Europe, from southern Europe, and establishing in this country. And increasing numbers of those are on what we would call non-native trees. and some of them are hideous. So sort of holm oak, for instance, evergreen oak, which from a nature reserve point of view is a nightmare to manage because it's quite self-seeding. But these species are now naturalized in this country and have arrived here of their own accord, and they're part of our fauna. So we need to think about that shift and how it's affecting the diversity of our ecosystems and which species are appropriate. And there will be some, for instance, we are probably going to be losing quite a lot of our ash trees. And I think for those in eastern England will probably say we already have. But over here in Dorset, it's not quite as bad as that yet. Now, which species are we going to encourage to perhaps replace that so we don't end up with vast amounts of sycamore replacing that gap? Would small leaf lime be something that we would need to encourage, for instance, because that grows well in southern Europe, it's present in this country, but it's not something we think of systematically as including within our tree mixes. Food for thought there. But coming back to grassland species, we've already got a really diverse grassland native flora, and much of that stretches the country. I think what is likely to change is the phenology of those. So that's the flowering times, and I think this comes to the point about choice of species and where we get them from. I'm quite keen on having local native sources of seed when it comes to sowing seed. But not to the extent that it's got to come within a few miles. A small biogeographic area like southern England would be fine for me, but we shouldn't be, for instance, choosing kidney vetch from Scotland and sowing it down in England or vice versa, because we will almost certainly find the flowering times have adapted locally to where they are currently in existence. And of course, the flowering times are critical to the invertebrates that then feed and nectar on them.
Well, yeah, and I like your description of those insects which are coming across the channel from southern Europe now being part of our fauna.
Well,
because people always say, but it's not native to the UK, and I always say, but nothing was native to the UK before the Pleistocene. I mean,
well, absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. Well, yeah, yes, quite. I mean, we're an island, and we weren't here a while ago, and
exactly.
so and indeed, in the previous interglacials, it looked rather different than it does now. So Norway spruce, for instance, was a native tree in the previous interglacial.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas now, and if you look at the number of species of insect that are feeding on Norway spruce, then it's halfway up the line, with oak and willow right at the top, and actually sycamore and ash and the rest of it way down below. Norway spruce holds on to a remarkably diverse fauna, and actually
numbers of moths.
it's great. I love it. So there's it's not easy, is it, when you start delving into the detail? There's nothing easy in ecology, but so there are some non-natives that I'm okay with, but I'm not okay with people planting buddleia in the wider countryside. Fine in your garden.
Buddleia is a bit, yeah. I don't know. It's hard because it's kind of one of those things that's a value judgment, and
it is,
and different people's values differ, and it's all very interesting, and I think that's why the society is such a good place, because we can talk about these things and not be, we can disagree, and it doesn't really matter.
Look,
there's a couple of very specific questions about invasion of light tolerant woody species, which I think you answered that does happen, but you can count them on the fingers and toes
at the moment.
At the moment, but that over time that would change. And there's another question about seawall embankments, and I think this might be interesting because in Dorset you do have roads near the sea, and so what do you do about those which have to be grassy but are very, very steep?
Right. My experience there is down at Lyme Regis, actually, where I was involved as the ecologist advising what was then West Dorset District Council in the construction of the Lyme Regis sea defences, the phase 4 defences. So if anybody's been down to Lyme Regis recently, they will see a brand new, I say relatively new, a few years old now, footway from the main car park down to the town. And it's wonderful because you no longer have to walk down the road. And that goes across the very, very steep, rugged cliffs. Those cliffs were falling into the sea, and left to their own devices, half of Lyme Regis would follow suit. So for better or worse judgments, the judgment was that area should be defended. So that meant that those areas were then soil nailed, which means long steel pins driven into the ground horizontally with plates that held back a steel mesh that was was laid over the top of the rugged ground. Now, my advice there was that we're changing from a naturally eroding system to one that's going to stabilize. So the ecology of that system would change from rough grasses and open ground and lots of birds for trefoils and all that sort of thing, in the end to scrub. But so we wanted native scrub on there, but also tussocky grasses. And one of the butterfly species I was particularly interested in trying to conserve there was the wood white butterfly, because that occurs on those steep, rugged cliffs, not instantly where it occurred there, but nearby. And that has now, after 7 years, moved into this area, which was created by this scheme on which I advised. So I'm absolutely delighted it's possible there to use, but what you need to do is to think about the species that are adapted to the local situation. So there we were talking about thug grasses as being important to the ecosystem. Tall fescue is one of the grasses there that I was most keen on because it forms these big tussocks, which provide stability and they provide shelter and they provide a really important food plant for a number of species, including one very rare moth. And that was all part of that ecosystem. Whereas if I saw tall fescue out on the Weymouth Relief Road, I'd go, oh, no,
But
it's
like a
it
weed.
is.
It's just a thing that's in the wrong place at the wrong
Yes,
time, isn't
exactly.
it?
Whereas, so it's about understanding which species are
Mm-hmm.
in the right place at the right time there.
Yep.
So things like rock samphire, for instance, would be an important species there that's part of that native suite of plants that's adapted to coping with the rugged scale of things. And for those who visit Portland from time to time, if you'll see there's some flood bunds that protect the development, including the Weymouth and Portland National Sailing Academy building, and those flood bunds were planted up with a specification by me. They were going to have hebe and all sorts of other kind of horrible things in them, frankly, which were totally out of place against Chesil Beach. And I said, we need to have the native flora there because they're the ones that will sustain themselves for longest. And so we had planters made up with sea thrift. And every year you get these wonderful, wonderful shows of pink flowers that have been there now ever since the Olympics, in fact, before the
My
Olympics.
total favorite plant, thrift.
It's
I
totally
love
wonderful.
thrift.
And that's because it's appropriate to the seaside environment where it can
Uh,
cope with the salt spray. And nobody needs to look after it. It's just there now.
It does its own thing.
It
Oh,
does.
Phil, it's been just an absolute joy having you with us this lunchtime. And thank you so much for staying so long and asking so many questions. And my apologies to any of you whose questions didn't get answered. But I think if you go back and look in the recording on YouTube, you'll find that some of them are answered in some of the questions, in some of the answers Phil gave to other questions. And I've come away thinking, what we need to do is not have a recipe for doing this, but actually just look at nature and see how it works and try to mimic it the best we can. So Phil, thank you so much for this. And we'll love to have you back. And please do, all of you who are not fellows of the Society, please do become a fellow and become a member of this great organization. Thank you so much, Phil. And thanks, Padma, for organizing everything.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure. Cheerio now.